Dear all out there in the darkness, very welcome to this 32nd celebration of the Olof Palmepris. And of course, a special welcome to Daniel Ellsberg. We'll come to you later, sir. Let me begin by honoring the memory of Lisbeth Palme, Olof Palme's wife, counselor, and life's companion, and a children's psychologist and chairwoman for UNICEF. Lisbeth was a constant participant in our annual ceremony, always ready to hand over the prize diploma with warm and wise words. She passed away last year, as did two of our previous awardees, Ludmila Alexieva, 2004 awardee. She was an advocate for human rights in the Soviet Union and Russia. And Kofi Annan, who got the prize in 2006, UN Secretary General. Our thoughts also go to Walid Sami Abu al-Khair, who received the Olof Palme Prize in 2012 for his sustained struggle to promote respect for human rights for both men and women in Saudi Arabia, against a regime that sends death squads and bone saws abroad and punishes its citizens at home with decapitation and torture. When he couldn't come himself to pick up the prize, he sent his wife, Samir Badawi, and she gave a speech for him. She is now arrested, and according to Amnesty International this last week, she and a few other women, human rights activists, have been tortured, sexually harassed, and otherwise ill-treated during their detention. We will not forget them. On a happier note, we salute our 2008 awardee, Denis Mukwege, who received the Nobel Prize last year. You are many who have come to honor Daniel Ellsberg from all walks of society, from government and parliament, diplomats and students, a vast number from civil society organizations and peace activists of all ages. We are happy to see you all here. Allow me to acknowledge the presence of Swedish Foreign Minister Margot Wallström and several of her colleagues from the government, Minister Hans Dahlgren, Matilda Ernkrans, Ardalan Shekarabi, Annika Strandhäll, and Anders Ygeman. That must be a record number of government members who come for this ceremony. We are happy for that. And we have also a special greeting for the Prime Minister, who is busy with some other activities, but his wife has transmitted, Ulla has transmitted his greetings to us all, and especially to you, Daniel. We also greet former Foreign Minister Hans Blix, who got the prize in 2003, for continuously working against the spread of weapons of mass destruction and for common security on the basis of international law. And as usual, we welcome Sweden's former Prime Minister, Ingvar Carlsson, who is here, together with a number of parliamentarians who have been engaged in this question against nuclear arms. Every year, the foundation spends about 2 million crowns on scholarships and projects in the spirit of Olof Palme. And they are mostly young people. And present today here are pupils from Björkbyskolan, 26 of them, with their teachers, who for 3 years prepared a project on human rights, including a visit to Auschwitz-Birkenau, and to further commitment to promote solidarity and tolerance. And we welcome them too. Well, let me now turn to Daniel Ellsberg, a walking legend, a living encyclopedia, a world champion for peace and common security, and the most dangerous man in America who must be stopped at any cost, according to Henry Kissinger. He is the author of 4 books, among them Secrets, a memoir of Vietnam and the Pentagon Papers, and recently, The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner, books that should be mandatory reading for members of parliament and governments all over the world. Daniel is also the grandfather of 5 grandchildren. Dear Daniel, you come to Stockholm accompanied by your wife, Patricia, who is here, and your daughter, Mary. Mary has a special relationship with Sweden. You worked at the Swedish embassy in Nicaragua during the hard years there, which led to studies at Umeå University, where you graduated with a dissertation on gender-based violence in Nicaragua. Your academic opponent at the time was Hans Rosling. Daniel, you arrived here at a dramatic and very dangerous time. Global security has deteriorated markedly, according to CIPRI, the yearbook 2018. Military expenditure is at its highest level since the end of the Cold War. And the state, we have now 9 nuclear states instead of 5, and they have almost 2,000 nuclear warheads kept in a state of high operational alert. And the military technical evolution currently giving dominance to 3 nuclear states: the US with 35% of the world's military expenditure, China with 13%, and Russia with 3.8%. But it is Russia and America who stand out with 92% of all nuclear warheads. And 5 days ago, the Bulletin of Atomic Sciences released its annual presentation of the Doomsday Clock, setting the clock at 2 minutes before the symbolic apocalyptic midnight. Only once before has it been that close to estimated global annihilation, in 1953, when the United States and the Soviet Union were in a nuclear arms race. Why are we so close to destruction? The answer is nuclear weapons and climate change. And may I also acknowledge the presence here of Greta Thunberg. And I know that Dan will be very happy because yesterday, when we were in London registering the Skavlan show, he mentioned Greta especially, and he wanted to meet her. Thank you for coming. Nuclear weapons and climate change. That same warning was delivered by Hans Blix, who is present here, in his speech at CIPRI annual meeting last year. He said, I quote, "The nuclear arsenals are enough to put an end to human civilization through rapid suicide, while at the same time adding the risk of slow suicide through global warming." Dear Daniel, you may take some comfort from the fact that you are now in a military non-aligned country free from nuclear arms, with a long history of diplomacy and dialogue in search for detente and peace. And at the Sälen Security Conference on the 15th of January last year, Foreign Minister Margaret Wallström stated that, I quote, "The risk that nuclear arms actually will be used is greater today than for a very much long time. Passivity is not an option," she said. And at the same conference, Prime Minister Stefan Löfven underlined, I quote, "The threat of nuclear war is the greatest threat to our common survival. Building security on threats of mutual destruction is untenable. We use diplomacy, international cooperation, and confidence-building measures in our work for peace and common security." Common security was, of course, the title of the 1982 Palme Commission report. The commission was founded by Palme in 1980, which gathered senior political leaders and experts from East and West, North and South, which was the first of its kind in those days. Palme defined the doctrine of common security like this: what has to be done is gradually to replace a security which is dependent upon constantly increasing armaments with a security which is basically political and which rests upon mutual trust. Political and ideological opponents must, despite fundamental differences of opinion, work together to avoid nuclear war that can only survive together or perish together. there will be no winner in a nuclear war. And this central theme was picked up by Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev in 1983, the same year. The report came the year after. And they both declared there can be no victors or winners in a nuclear war. And together at their summit meeting in Geneva in November 1985, they said the following in a joint communique: the sides have agreed that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Words taken out of the Palme Commission report. Let me therefore also here recognize the presence of two key people behind the Palme Commission report: Anders Ferm, who was a member of the Commission, and Hans Dahlgren, the Executive Secretary of the Commission, and today Sweden's EU Affairs Minister. Sweden's commitment to an active peace policy started with Hjalmar Branting, who formed Sweden's first social democratic government 99 years ago, and he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1921. 40 years later, in 1961, the so-called Undén Plan was adopted by the UN General Assembly, named after Swedish Foreign Minister Östen Undén. The plan was to create a non-atom club in order to press upon the 5 nuclear states to agree upon a test ban treaty, in spite of the strong opposition from the United States and their allies at the time. The plan probably influenced the adoption of the partial test ban treaty in 1963. At the time, Sweden had an ongoing debate whether to arm its defense forces with nuclear arms. Olof Palme was the secretary of the committee which investigated the issue. And later, in a speech at MIT in USA, Palme stated that a committee had decided that such a program would lessen Sweden's security, and he concluded, therefore, for Sweden to acquire nuclear weapons would indeed be a destabilizing act and which would disturb the security arrangements in our parts of Europe. This was in the late 60s, and the most effective opposition to the bomb came from the feminist peace movement. And individuals like Barbro Alving, Åsa Moberg, Ingrid Segerstedt Wiberg, Alva Myrdal, Inga Thorsson, and later Maj-Britt Theorin, here present, Karin Söder, Anna Lindh, and Margot Wallström have been at the forefront of this feminist foreign policy. In 1982, Alva Myrdal also got the Nobel Peace Prize, together with Alfonso Garcia Marquez, for her peace work. Of course, there were a few men also, like Östen Undén, and already in 1956, Swedish author Harry Martinson wrote his epic space tale Aniara, which was made into an opera and now also into film. And in his long poem, Martinson wrote, and I quote, "God and Satan, hand in hand, in a destroyed and poisoned land, fled from man, the king of ashes." Let me also highlight Olof Palme's speech at the first United Nations Conference on Human Environment here in Stockholm in 1972. In his opening speech, the Prime Minister raised in dramatically undiplomatic terms the US actions in Vietnam, which he considered in Vietnam to be ecocide. I quote, "The indiscriminated bombing, the large-scale use of bulldozers, the use of herbicides is an outrage," he said. The speech did not endear him to Nixon's delegation. Later in 1980, Palme advocated for a nuclear-free zone in the Nordic region, and this was an outcome from other international initiatives. And also in the 1980s, he was requested by the Parliamentarians for Global Action to form the so-called Six Nation Initiative, which came at a time when relations between the Soviet Union and USA were very bad. And the countries Argentina, Greece, India, Mexico, Tanzania, and Sweden established thus this initiative, and they provided also scientists and experts of all kinds, and the thing was to press for test ban and reduction of nuclear arms. In a meeting in New Delhi in '85, Palme denounced the nuclear states for holding mankind as hostage in a colonial manner by their possession of the doomsday weapon. And he said, "We, the non-nuclears, also want to have a say on these matters of life and death. Later on, after Palme's death, Ingvar Carlsson continued the Six Nation Initiative. Now, Daniel, it is not easy to confront military giants and nuclear powers. They can threaten and blackmail. And during the Vietnam War, the Nixon administration mobilized dock workers on the East Coast, threatening not to unload Volvo cars if Olof Palme continued to denounce the war. Prime Minister Erlander at the time stood, however, by Olof Palme, like Palme himself stood fast, firm, when the Soviet Union criticized him for having criticized and denounced the invasion of Czechoslovakia and Afghanistan. And in 1995, a member of the Swedish government took a week of vacation to join the international protests against the resumed French nuclear test at the Mururoa atoll in the Pacific. And when Prime Minister Ingvar Carlsson defended her right to protest, a furious President Chirac reacted by canceling the planned official visit by the Prime Minister. But he stood by his minister, who, by the way, was Margot Wallström. And today, from the other side of the Atlantic, also on the nuclear issue, we hear messages, friendly advice, that could be perceived as blackmail and threats. Dear Daniel, I'm coming to the end. This history is not history. It is very much alive today in the present. Sweden was voted into the United Nations Security Council 2016 to 18 for its track record of international solidarity and independent active diplomacy in global affairs. This is a unique asset in the quest for peace and disarmament. It gives you credibility and freedom of action, as we have seen most recently in the cases of Yemen and North Korea. In presenting his new government on 21st of January, the Prime Minister said, "Military non-alliance is our foundation. Sweden will not apply for membership of NATO." And the majority of Swedes are in agreement with the Prime Minister, and an even greater majority, 8 out of 10, want Sweden to ratify the nuclear weapon ban treaty, which we voted for last year. So, it should not be up to older generations only to be in the vanguard to saving the world from nuclear extermination. But let us take inspiration and guidance from a person who has seen the beast in the eye and who offers unique information from the heart of darkness. The motivation for the 2018 Palmepris goes as follows. When Daniel Ellsberg, a former military analyst and the world's most important whistleblower, exposed the US government's secret war plans for Vietnam in 1971, he was well aware of risking a long time in prison and a spoiled career. Regardless of such consequences, his decision led to the removal of a mendacious government, a shortening of an illegal war, and an untold number of saved lives. More than 4 decades later, Daniel Ellsberg again takes on Pentagon's secret war plans. He warns us of a nuclear holocaust caused by the refusal of the 9 nuclear states to comply with the binding commitment of the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons to further the goals of a nuclear-free world. The Olof Palme Prize of 2018 goes to Daniel Ellsberg for his profound humanism and exceptional moral courage. I ask now Joachim Palme to come up here to take the floor.
Thank you, Pierre. I stand here as the family representative of the board of the Olof Palme Memorial Foundation. And it's an honor and privilege to stand here before you. It's promised a short speech. You can relax. It's been very short. And for good reasons, I will make room for others. But I would just like to say that I think it's fair to claim that my father was a very engaged politician, and that there were two themes in his political engagement that were especially strong. One was the fight against the Vietnam War, and the other was the fight against nuclear armament. Those two themes, you, Daniel Ellsberg, have made outstanding contributions. So you were sort of brothers in arms, or maybe soulmates is a better expression. So I think there are good reasons to congratulate ourselves for this excellent choice of prize winner for 2018. I think there is no better person to hand over the prize this year than Margot Wallström. So I would like to ask Margot Wallström to enter the stage and give her a warm applause.
So dear Daniel Ellsberg, with family, excellencies, dear friends, thank you very much. This is indeed a great honor bestowed on me to be able to hand over the prize to you, Daniel Ellsberg. I wrote down some of the names you've been called. A military man, a whistleblower, a troublemaker, a visionary, a fighter, a nuclear disarmament advocate, a grandfather, and most importantly, a very courageous human being. And I think you inspire us all to think about, what do we want to be called? By our grandchildren or by future. Welcome up on stage.
After the appearance of our secret guest here, Margot Wallström, I would now like to ask Rickard Söderberg to enter the scene. He is, of course, our very famous tenor, but also a human rights activist in a very broad sense. Very welcome, Rickard Söderberg. Rickard is accompanied by my son Darling, who has been working with him for some decades, very successfully.
Strider blott natten ser, tonar till heder om vila den ber. vind ifrån sydväst, och smeker ljuvlig sjömanskind av alla vindar bäst. Till havs, till storm du djärva jakt, till havs, till storms var man på vakt, till havs. Sväll härligt sköna segelsväll i vindens dust, flyg fram med fröjd mot vågens fjäll i stundens högsta lust. Till havs, till havs, till storm du djärva jakt, till havs, till storms var man på vakt, till havs.
They will be back. They will be back. And now, Daniel, are you ready to spread the word? Please. Please. Come on.
Oh, I didn't bring up the book. Can I have it? I am very honored by this audience, and I'm very honored by the occasion and by this picture. I was asking myself if there was the name, if I could think of another historic name that I would be comparably honored to receive an award bearing that name as Olof Palme, and it's not easy to think of one. I can without any exaggeration or anything, the words Mikhail Gorbachev came to my mind, and also Nelson Mandela. And neither more nor less honored would I be if this were an award in their names, because I think of these three people very comparably as exceptions to the line by Axel Oxenstierna that I have often pondered and thought about and appreciated to his son. My son, do you not know with how little wisdom the world is governed? And here were three people that combined not only wisdom, but much more uncommonly in combination, moral courage, which is necessary. It led me to ask, with what wisdom and moral courage would Olof Palme be speaking today in the situation we're in and to the issues we're addressing? Now, to some extent, I think that's possible to answer. First of all, I've just had a wonderful trip with Pierre Shorey, my new friend, a soul brother really, and realized that just as I was a speechwriter for Secretary of Defense McNamara at one point, I was speaking to someone who had the privilege of putting down Olof Palme's words from his own mouth. And so I asked him what he thought Olof Palme would be saying, but not to give his answer exactly. I believe that on the issue that's immediate here of the UN ban and of entry into NATO for that matter, Margot Wallström is expressing very much what Olof Palme would be saying. It struck me, as I'll go into, that in learning about Palme's life in just the last few weeks since Pierre informed me of this wonderful award, I was looking into his life and found a remarkable number of coincidences, in effect, of intersections of our life story. He's 4 years older than I am, not that much. As I say, Pierre Shorey here is like a brother, my younger brother, a few years younger here. But Olof was 4 years older. We went through much in same historical experiences. I met him in 1978 here in Sweden when I was here to campaign against the neutron bomb, where he was in full agreement with my concern about that. But I was also very impressed in my mind by the fact that 10 years earlier, in 1968, I'd come back from Vietnam in the spring of 1967. He was marching in Stockholm against the Vietnam War. Not yet prime minister, he was a minister, I believe, of education perhaps at that time, culture, but anyway, he was taking that step, which of course angered my government very much. I just left the government, got back to the Rand Corporation, but the fact that he would do that is very much in line against with Swedish tradition, as Pierre was telling me and just announced that Margot Wallström found it on leave of absence, going to Mururoa and taking a similar position. In fact, I'll tell you why I thought, actually at that very time, in March of '68, when I read that, I asked myself, what was I doing in March of '68? And the answer was, I was conducting my first unauthorized disclosures, my first leaks of top secret information to the New York Times about the plans, the requests for General Westmoreland for the use of nuclear weapons in Vietnam. It was in 1968. He made that request before the Tet Offensive. No, I'm sorry, essentially during the Tet Offensive. It was considered, as I knew, and the leaks I was giving were entirely intended to forestall, if possible, by evoking public protest to the reinforcements that he was asking, 206,000 more men in addition to the 500,000 we had there then, which I believed would lead, and were intended to lead, to the invasion of North Vietnam by us, which would bring the Chinese in and would in fact cause us to use nuclear weapons against the Chinese. It's had long been our policy in contingency planning, in addition to the weapons he wanted to use, Westmoreland, at the time of Khe Sanh, at that very time, when Palme was marching. So he was helping to forestall, as one of the marchers, that onset, the end of the moratorium on the combat use of nuclear weapons. As I say, I'm going to come back to this, but I saw time and again how many times our lives had coincided in response to the same events. And I was thinking very few of your awardees must have felt that same identification with Olof Palme specifically in getting the Olof Palme Award. And then I reflected that was quite untrue. They weren't all working on my subject of nuclear weapons. But what subject would earn this award? Humanitarian concerns, human rights, the rule of law, in the environment, or now, where that person would not have had occasion to have the same feeling. Olof Palme and I were working together unknowingly on this issue. On the climate issue, the change in climate, which we're facing, a crisis to civilization and humanity comparable to the nuclear existential crisis, both threatening civilization entirely. I don't want ever get into the argument as to which is more urgent, which is more important. Those are two comparable, very crucial crisis situations we're facing. And I think we know what Olof Palme would be saying about that if he were here today. But he is here, in effect, being channeled through another Swede, Greta Thunberg. And is it true? I heard with great excitement here when Pierre saying that she actually is in the audience. Is that true? I know she doesn't seek public acclaim and is shy, but I'd love to see her if I could. Could you stand up, Greta, if you're actually here? Not here? Okay. I said to Pierre on our trip the other day first that My first thought was, everyone in the world wants to meet her, I don't want to impose on her. Then, having heard her Skavlan interview last night at midnight on a video, I sent him to his room an email saying, I changed my mind, I do want to impose on her. I would love to meet her. And he told me, well, she doesn't, she lives outside of Stockholm, it's really hard. And I said, my temptation, of course, would be to enlist her voice on my issue here, our issue. I'd love to give her my book and have her read that. But again, I don't want to distract her from the immensely important work she's doing on climate. But she does, in fact, inspire me as I watch to be as straightforward and forthright as she is, remarkably lucid and not to mince words in a way. Now, Palme, of course, was controversial in part because you could almost say that he was like Greta Thunberg in his willingness to speak frankly and clearly and about issues, and to, as he said, recognize things by their true names and recognize realities. Very specifically, in March of '68, I just reread his words, actually, in the press conference at that time, protesting. I'm sorry, take it back. In '72, again, another corresponding thing here, I was on trial at that point, but in '72, when Nixon was bombing Hanoi, in a year in which he had proposed and considered the use of nuclear weapons against North Vietnam, again, not for the first time, in '72. And the bombing of Hanoi in December of '72, Palme riled the United States very considerably by saying, let us recognize things by their true names. This is torture, torment of a country to induce their compliance. That was extraordinarily resonant with me when I read it, and I'll tell you why. My wife is sitting here now. In 1971, we got married in mid-70. I'd copied the Pentagon Papers a year earlier in '69. Let me mention another corresponding thing with Palme. He became prime minister in October 14th, 1969. That date struck me. I thought that is exactly 2 weeks before I started copying the Pentagon Papers. It was one day before 2 million people marched in America, in towns all across the country, on what was called a moratorium because it was really a general strike. It was a weekday stoppage of studies at universities and of work, people walking out and spending the day in town after town protesting the Vietnam War. And it clearly was a work stoppage, like a general strike. And they decided that it was too provocative to call it a general strike, so they called it a moratorium, taking leave of absence, the way Margot Wallström did over the French testing for a week. And what was the significance of that? Well, first of all, I was copying the Pentagon Papers starting on October 1st, not really in the belief of what was about to come, and I was accompanied in that by another family member, my daughter, who is here today, who was helping me copy at one point on one night. That was a particular night when I'd wanted my 2 children to see that what I was doing was civil disobedience, yes, but it was in a sober, businesslike way that I knew that I would be called names much worse than the ones you mentioned, Madam Wallström, that I've often been called, but including crazy, and that I wanted them to see that I was doing this in a straightforward way because I thought it was the right thing to do at that time. It had to be done. I hadn't gone crazy. And so my son, Robert, was copying, actually, the papers on a Xerox machine, and I was collating, and Mary, who was then 10, was cutting top secret off the tops and bottoms of the pages with the scissors. And that ran in the family very much. She's now been working in the Sandinista government, which was where Olof Palme was the single state leader, to visit the Sandinista regime. Mary is one of 2 American women who were working directly for the Sandinista regime at that time, and I have 2 Nicaraguan grandchildren. But the issue was greater than I realized at the time, or the 2 million people realized. Because in fact, Nixon had delivered, through Kissinger and others, direct threats to North Vietnam and conveyed through Russia of initiating nuclear war on November 3rd, 2 weeks later, after the October 15th moratorium. And if his terms were not achieved, which included mutual withdrawal of the North Vietnamese troops from the southern half of their country, along with withdrawal of American troops to our part of the side of the ocean. And that was never agreed to, but by the North Vietnamese government then. But in fact, Nixon had plans drawn, and a friend of mine, Roger Morris, who was working for Kissinger then, saw the nuclear target folders, one of them 1.5 miles from the Chinese border. This is 1969 now, with almost exactly the same intentions that Westmoreland had said 1 year earlier, that a nuclear weapon on the Chinese border, or in Quezon, down south, would convey the message to the North Vietnamese that they must back off entirely. And Nixon's had that intention too. So the 2 million people who marched on October 15th, the day after Palme's inauguration over here, extended the moratorium on nuclear weapons till now. To say that is to say that there has certainly not been a taboo against nuclear weapons use or first use, initiation of nuclear war, in the sense of planning for it, preparing for it, making all preparations, and threatening it. In the statement approvingly reflected by Palme's own statement that we just heard, by Reagan and Gorbachev, many people have approved it, reasonably so. Nuclear war cannot be won and must not be fought. They said that, I believe, in 1986. And Reagan had actually said it earlier. But he was in the greatest military buildup of nuclear weapons at that time since Kennedy, and the greatest till now, right now, under Obama and Trump. Enormous buildup, despite the fact that nuclear war cannot be won and must be fought. What's the explanation of this apparent contradiction? He did not say nuclear war must not be threatened or prepared for or risked. On the contrary, from the very beginning of the nuclear era, the preparation for nuclear war has been a preoccupation of my country. And within years after that, in imitation of the Soviet Union, now Russia, and a few other countries. As E.P. Thompson once said, it's misleading to say that the US and then the Soviet Union have military-industrial complexes. More accurate to say they are military-industrial complexes. And that has not been disproven till now. What is the motive for the huge buildup on both sides? Well, I can only speak for America. I have little question that it is the preparation that is highly profitable to Boeing, Raytheon, Grumman, and Lockheed, to build these weapons that was now, as it is then, was then highly profitable on both sides. And I have heard Mikhail Gorbachev quoted to a friend of mine as saying, and it's the same over here. After all, no longer a communist system in Russia, their military-industrial complex, which they've always had, now works on profit just the same as ours. And that is pushing it forward with no apparent break at all. Now, when I say that I was very struck by the statement by Palme, that what we were looking at was torture, a very unusual statement. The reason that resonated so much with me when I said it was that there had come a time when I felt my wife, Patricia, needed to look at some of the Pentagon papers. We'd been married. I'd copied them almost 2 years earlier and given them to the Senate. Then we'd gotten married, but I had no desire to have her fingerprints on the pages or to be involved in the distribution. So I told her in general terms what I was doing, but had not involved her and not given her any of them to read. In early '71, when Senator Fulbright, to whom I'd given them, decided it was too risky for him to actually put them out as he had initially promised, and really his aide told me, because Defense Department would shift foreign military aid from his committee, Foreign Relations, to the Armed Services Committee, that they could trust more, not to put out classified information. So rather than lose that ability to have zero effect on foreign military aid, but have it come through him, he decided not to put them out. So Patricia had said to me, these senators don't seem to think it's that important. Why do you think so? That it's worth, they could do it without any risk, personally. Why do you think it's worth going to prison to put these out? I said, I think it's time for you to look at them. One difference, maybe they're right. I don't know whether it'll have any effect. But I've read them, and they haven't. So I have to make my judgment on this. Time for you to read them. So I gave her 100 pages from 1965 when I'd been in the Pentagon as the Special Assistant to the Assistant Secretary of Defense, who was essentially in charge of the military civilian input to the military planning. She came, it was when we started the bombing. And actually, I was there in the planning for the bombing at a time when our president was saying, we seek no wider war. The Tonkin Gulf incident involved no provocation. It was in international waters, et cetera. I knew all of those were flat lies, and I knew that the planning for a wider war was going on at that moment, and I was part of it, even though I was dubious about it, as was my immediate boss. But we both worked for the Secretary of Defense, and so we went along with it. I'm ashamed to say, speaking of shame, my friend Roger Morris said later, after the question of the bombing threats in 1969 came out, he said, we should have thrown open the safes and screamed bloody murder, because that's exactly what it was. And he said it was his greatest shame that he had not done so, and he had kept his silence about what he and his colleagues knew were illegal, immoral, and horribly dangerous and foolish episodes. Okay, so I showed this information to Patricia, and she came back to me with tears in her eyes. She was holding the pages. She said, listen to this discussion. Another turn of the screw on bombing strategy. Not all at once, bit by bit, step by step, as the UN would say, to get them into line. Water drip technique, water torture. That's waterboarding, the term they were using. Cause more pain in this, to judge how much bombing to do. And she said to me, this is the language of torturers. And that cut through to me, because as a Marine, battalion operations officer in charge of training, as a Marine company commander, I had instructed on the laws of war, but beyond the laws of war, I had always thought, torture is out. I will never be part of it. I will expose it. I would not partake, et cetera, et cetera. I will never be part of that at all. And here she was telling me that what I had been involved in could be described as Palme called it, torture. A better name actually could be terror. So she said, you've got to do it, you know, you've got to do it. And from that time on, she was a full partner in the process, and she did get her fingerprints on the paper. And the only reason it turned out that she was not a co-defendant for me, or an unindicted co-conspirator, was that she had never been fingerprinted, it turned out. So they weren't able to identify her. Okay. In '78, when I was talking to Palme about the neutron bomb, after which I went back to the US, sat on railroad tracks, that were carrying radioactive waste out of Rocky Flats nuclear production facility. They had to do that because the radioactivity would have prevented production otherwise. Rocky Flats was producing the neutron components, the plutonium components for neutron bombs. I felt it was the most dangerous weapon that had ever come in because it looked like a usable weapon. It had very limited effects. The communists called it a capitalist weapon because it killed humans without destroying the tanks they were in or the factories they were in. The neutrons went through and killed the humans. The Soviets, of course, went on to get their own neutron bombs. But the danger of it, I felt, was that it could tempt people to believe that these were usable weapons. They were small enough that they could be the match that would ignite all-out nuclear war. And I'm reading now history. This is where I came in. That was in 1978. As of this week, we have begun testing low-yield weapons, 5 kiloton, less than that, where Hiroshima was 15 kilotons, for use on our Trident submarines, as the Russians have, low-yield weapons, and also for weapons for Europe. The B-6112 weapon, a variable yield that can go down to as little as 5 kilotons. For what purpose? No other purpose than to initiate nuclear war in a usable way. Well, it's a threat. Yes, it's only a threat. But, in fact, it's very clear that as in the past, it is thought of in both Russian and US terms, and Putin is talking about the very same kinds of weapons that would offer themselves for use in a conflict and could be the match that turned it on. For example, Putin in Kaliningrad is imitating the exact technique by which, when I was in the government, we were, quote, defending West Berlin. Militarily indefensible with conventional weapons, so the only way to hold on to it was to threaten to blow the world up if they went into West Berlin. And actually, I believe it worked. It had its effect. And now that Putin has lost the Warsaw Pact, now that his conventional forces are inferior, and in particular, Kaliningrad is inside NATO territory, just like West Berlin, between Lithuania and Poland, he has put Iskander missiles, dual-purpose missiles, and threatened or forecast the possibility of putting nuclear warheads in them to deter anybody who thought of taking Kaliningrad. Well, that can work. Deterrence can work. And if it doesn't work, the world goes. The weapons that Putin is accused of as violating the INF Treaty, perhaps 6 miles under the 500-mile limit or not, would annihilate, would lead to the destruction of Russia if they were used. And likewise, the Pershing II and the others on our side. There is a lunacy involved here, in other words, of which is part, and I'll just close by saying this because my time is up here. Overall. For Sweden to be in NATO, as some would like, a minority as I understand it, but some, would mean shutting a voice like Palme's off, adopting a silence, a vow of silence in criticism of mad American policies, just as every other member of NATO has kept silence, what I would call a crime of silence. A year before he was killed, Martin Luther King in the Riverside Church said, "There comes a time when silence is betrayal." And that is true now. Silence about the policies of the US and Russia with their doomsday machines, which I haven't described, but perhaps in our discussion we'll get into, are the greatest threats. It's not just nuclear weapons. It's the nuclear weapons, not only of the US and Russia, but overwhelmingly of the US and Russia, and not only in their numbers, but in their policy. The launch-on warning that both of them have, the first-use policies that both of them have, including NATO, now there's no Warsaw Pact anymore, the decapitation policies, which are insane, I'll go into those, all of these insane policies which have supported preparation for war at high profit and supported an alliance which is both profitable and strategically reassuring to a lot of people. All of this is at the cost of preserving a genuine risk, a non-zero risk from day to day and year to year of ending most life on Earth. That is a cost, that is a policy that Sweden, in my opinion, we'll get into this later, but should not be part of, is honored by not having been part of it, and I think it's essential that Sweden regain the reputation that they had under Olof Palme as the conscience of the world. Because they're better than everybody else? Not necessarily, but because they have maintained a position that allows you to speak frankly, both sides. Russia, after all, cannot be criticized in their crazy Kaliningrad and Iskander missiles and all the new ICBMs they're building, because in every respect they are imitating what we do, what the US does. And if you can't criticize the US for fear of hurting relations with this rich, friendly, wonderful nation, then you're part of it. And that shouldn't be the case. So when Palme said, the obstacles to change, to disarmament, are very large, he said several times in his speeches, it's an uphill fight. But he said, I still hope. And I wish to close by saying, when the question came up on climate, which raises almost all the same issues at all, Greta Thunberg was asked what her feelings of hope were. She rejected the idea of hope. She said, I want action. Well, those are not inconsistent. My friend Joanna Macy has long said, hope is not a feeling or an expectation. It's a way of acting. And that can go together. So it is important that Sweden not sacrifice, in my opinion, not sacrifice its ability to speak with the voice of Olof Palme and to act as the conscience the world desperately needs. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will now call upon Mikael Wiehe, our Woody Guthrie or Bob Dylan, but also a true musician, composer, and human rights activist. He's a leftist, but he's always on the right side.
This is the first time I sing it in English, since I sang Simon and Garfunkel songs in the streets of Paris in 1967. Let's hope for the best. This is a song to courage. Simple little song to all who know the day will break, though nights can be so long. This is a song to courage, a song with no refrain, though some might find it meaningless, I sing it all the same. this is a song to courage, to laughter, hope and fun, to all who trust the strength of love when hatred is so strong, to those who are building bridges, to those who open doors, to those who think we will achieve what we've been fighting for. Yeah, this is a song to courage, to those who dare to see, to those who won't be silenced, but speak out fearlessly, to all who unite and stand up through hardship and distress, to those who know how much it takes and yet will say their yes. Yeah, this is a song to everyone refusing to give up, to those who keep on struggling, though life can be so tough, to those who keep on longing for things we've yet to see, to those who fight for righteousness and never will retreat. Yeah, this is a song to courage, a song from me to you, a simple little tune to sing, to strength and patience too. So care for it well and learn it and sing it out aloud, 'cause then the song will grow and spread the whole wide world around. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Mikael Wiehe. It feels almost, Daniel, as he has been there, out there before us even, because he has such a strong influence by his singing and writing. Thank you, Mikael. Now we will have a short panel discussion between Daniel Ellsberg and Josephine Lind from Doctors Against Nuclear Arms, under the stern leadership of Anna Sundström for the Olof Palme International Center. Please take the floor. Okay, sorry. I get new instructions. We will have a short video message to Daniel Ellsberg from Professor Max Tegmark at MIT. No, yes, MIT in Cambridge. It's 3 minutes long, I think, and then we will have. So, back to your seats, Daniel.
As a scientist, it's a great honor for me to help celebrate Daniel Ellsberg today. Because scientists and whistleblowers are driven by the same conviction. Seek the truth and speak the truth, even if those in power don't like it. One important truth that Daniel has helped spread is the need for nuclear disarmament. And next month, those of you here from the Swedish government will make an important decision. Should Sweden join 70 other nations and sign the United Nations Nuclear Ban Treaty to stigmatize these disgusting weapons of mass destruction and to pressure the superpowers to reduce their excessive nuclear arsenals? Here is the inconvenient truth. Sweden is not hesitating because the moral or scientific case for this is complicated. It isn't. No, we're hesitating because Donald Trump's government doesn't want us to sign this treaty. So when you make your decision next month, please ask yourself this. What would Daniel Ellsberg do? What would Olof Palme do? Are we celebrating Daniel Ellsberg and Olof Palme today because they always pandered to power? Or are we celebrating them for having the courage to speak truth to power? I helped organize an open letter from 30 Nobel laureates and thousands of other scientists from 100 countries speaking truth to power in support of the Nuclear Ban Treaty. And here's what some of them said.
Today, the United Nations is considering a ban on nuclear weapons. The political effect of that ban is by no means clear, but the moral effect is quite clear. What we are saying is there ought to be a ban on nuclear weapons.
The only solution to this problem is to get rid of nuclear weapons.
I support the ban treaty.
I completely support a ban.
I support the proposed ban on nuclear weapons.
So I'm strongly in support of an international ban on nuclear weapons.
As a mother and scientist, I wish you good luck with the negotiations. The world and future generations depend on your success.
This is a great example of how the moral leadership of Daniel Ellsberg isn't just a thing of the past, but something that's as important as ever. A small group of countries with a minority of the world's population insist on retaining the right to ruin life on Earth for everyone else with nuclear weapons. Will the Swedish government have the courage to speak truth to power? Daniel Ellsberg has this courage. Olof Palme had this courage and made Sweden a globally respected moral leader precisely because he spoke truth to power, even about the Vietnam War to Nixon and about the Prague Spring to Brezhnev. So let's all celebrate these two inspiring men, not merely with words and ceremonies, but also with deeds, deeds showing their brand of courage.
So please join me, yes, you can sit there, and Josephine, if you sit on my other side. So please now join me up on stage, of course, our laureate for the day, and Josephine Lind, the Secretary General of the Swedish Physician Against Nuclear Arms. So, Mr. Ellsberg, the book, The Doomsday Machine. So could you please tell us a little bit about the concept of the doomsday machine and the nuclear winter that you also describe in your book. I know that you often use the quote that we are heading against an iceberg in dark waters. What is the effect when we then hit an iceberg?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Is this working? Yes? Let me answer that in two stages. First, the concept was actually invented by a colleague of mine, Herman Kahn, a friend of mine then at Rand Corporation, of a doomsday machine, a conceptual, a hypothetical system that would, under certain stimulus conveyed by computers and concentration, would automatically end all life on Earth. And he wanted to contrast this to various systems. He said, you know, it has a very good deterrent appearance. That would be a deterrence. You could say if there's one weapon on our country, if there are 10 weapons on our country. Or you could say if somebody has, a mayor of Cologne or whatever has insulted us, you could make it any way you want for the computers to interpret it. It would destroy life on Earth. He said, but obviously this is undesirable. It's a good deterrent, but that's not the only consideration. This applies, by the way, to things like joining NATO, putting weapons in Kaliningrad, putting new IRBMs in Europe. Yes, they could deter, but is that the only consideration? What are the risks? And he said in the case of a doomsday machine, it kills too many people, in fact, everyone. And that's not desirable. And he said, there exists no doomsday machine now, and there never will be. They won't do that. He was mistaken. We had a doomsday machine right then, and we've had it ever since. And it had existed, in fact, years before that. Now, we didn't recognize that precisely for another 20 years into the nuclear era. In fact, what we did recognize for a few of us who were privy to the information was the following. I drafted a question for the President, John F. Kennedy, in the spring of 1961 to give to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I'd actually drafted it for the Secretary of Defense, but the assistant to McGeorge Bundy, the National Security Assistant, looked at the questions and picked that one out of a large list of questions and sent it to the Joint Chiefs in the name of the President. And the question was, if your present plans are carried out as planned, not interfered with by divine wind or something, or unreliability, they were carried out and hit the targets they were intended, that's the implication, how many people would be killed? And I actually wrote that in the belief that some Air Force colonels had given me in the plans division that they hadn't actually calculated that. And we'd embarrass them bureaucratically by their having to admit that they needed more time to really look into this. Simple question. They were wrong, and I was wrong. The Joint Chiefs came back with a chart right away by Pentagon standards, actually in a week, which was very rapid. And it was in the form of a chart. On the vertical axis, millions killed. On the horizontal axis, time, as radioactivity fallout had time to go over Europe and elsewhere. It was a straight line, so it was a simple calculation, went up over time with the fallout. The immediate deaths, they said, on the chart, would be 285 million people. Over 6 months, another 50 million. In the USSR and China alone. I should mention, by the way, two things about our plans then. We were talking about first strike plans, not deterrent plans. The plans of the Joint Chiefs then and now were not to be caught on the ground under any circumstances. Either we would strike first in the court, not out of the blue, not a preventive war, but in the course of a non-nuclear conflict in the world, Berlin, perhaps, for example. Second, they involved, as I knew, hitting China as well under any circumstances, the concept of a Sino-Soviet bloc. Now remember, this was 61. The Sino-Soviet bloc had begun to dissolve at least 2 years earlier, and that was far gone by 61. But the idea was, under any circumstances of armed conflict, this was under Eisenhower, armed conflict with the Soviet Union, we will execute our war plan, which was a first strike plan. The other possibility, not in 61, was if they're on the way attacking us and our warning tells us we will get our ICBMs off the ground before they can be destroyed, and again, it will be a first strike on our part, but as they said, striking second first, preemption in effect. So the plan they were saying was an answer to a first strike plan, not a retaliation to nuclear weapons having arrived, that would kill 325 million people in Russia, the USSR, and China alone. It hit every city over 100,000 in Russia and 80% of the cities over 50,000. So that's how you got up to 325 million. Well, they had a calculation then. So that's not doomsday, of course, that's 325 million. So, which was then 10% of the world's population. It was then 3 billion. Well, they had the answer. So I asked another question, which sent to them. How many altogether? This came back not in a chart, but in a form, outline. Again, just another week, they had it. Another 100 million in East Europe, the captive countries, the satellite countries, Hungary, East Germany, Romania, with hitting their air defenses and their Soviet bases, and the fallout, not actually their cities directly, but the fallout would wipe them out. Depending on which way the wind blew, which depended on the season, another 100 million in West Europe, our allies, would be wiped out by radioactive fallout from our weapons without a single warhead landing on them. The question was not asked, what will the Russians do to us or them, in reply? And that's another 200 million then. And a third 100 million, this is roughly, but it was pretty close, to neutrals and nations contiguous to the Sino-Soviet bloc. Austria, Afghanistan, northern India, most of Japan. Finland would be wiped out without a single warhead landing on Finland, except by accident, from the ground bursts on the submarine pens in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, near Finland. Radioactive warfare would wipe out Finland, striking to an American for reasons maybe, I don't know how obvious to you, but we'd always thought of plucky little Finland who had paid their war debt after World War II and had been very courageous fighting the Russians and so forth, would be wiped out by our fallout, and of course Sweden and Norway. I understand, by the way, I've been reading up on this, good book by, interesting outline by Robert Dalscher, explaining what Palme has also explained in what I was reading, that an early reason for Sweden not to have nuclear weapons, aside from the, not to have their own nuclear weapons, this was aside from neutrality, was the hope that the fear that if they had nuclear weapons, Sweden would be the target of initial attacks because of their own nuclear weapons, whether they were in NATO or not. But if they didn't have nuclear weapons, they would not be targeted in the initial attacks. The warheads would go to countries that did have them. And so they would escape the initial attacks, and possibly altogether. It's funny for me to read this, but the hope was they would run out of warheads on the other side, and maybe they wouldn't get around to Sweden. But all of this reflected the idea that to be annihilated in World War III, you had to be targeted. You had to be on one block or the other. That was not true at all. Radioactivity, fallout, doesn't pay any attention to borders or to neutrality or commitments or alliances or whatever. So just like Finland, Sweden would go from our weapons. That's a total of 600 million, or 100 holocausts, as I read it. And it was stunning to think that colleagues that I worked with in the plans division, that I was then a civilian consultant from RAND, that I drank beer with in the evening, ordinary, nice people, had made plans that were not genocidal. They were multi-genocidal. But not yet, you might say, a doomsday machine. But Eurasia would go from our attack. But if I'm sorry, I know I'm going on here, but this is such a key point on the doomsday as to what we're talking about. It wasn't for another 20 years that new studies, which were first published in a Swedish journal, Ambio, I believe, on looking back on what had destroyed the dinosaurs 65 million years ago, and which led into the discussions of nuclear winter the next year. Carl Sagan, some Russian scientists, and Turco and various others, now looked for the first time at smoke. Now, it wasn't just smoke that would, like the Gulf oil wells that were put on fire, which quickly rained out or came down and didn't cause any regional major effect. This smoke would be lofted by firestorms, which I won't go into, but which are the unusual effect of nuclear weapons, achieved only 3 times without nuclear weapons: Hamburg, Dresden, and Tokyo. And in such fires, widespread fires, each of which Tokyo killed over 100,000 people, the smoke is lofted by a very strong updraft into the stratosphere where it doesn't rain out. It stays there for what we now know around the globe is a decade. In the first look at this in 1983, the computers were only powerful enough to say what would happen a year from now, and would go on for a year. Now they can say a decade, causing ice age conditions on the surface of the Earth around the globe, including the southern hemisphere, and killing all harvests worldwide. Now, global supplies of food at any given time are about 60 days, concentrated in a few countries for export, like ours. Those countries would last a little longer. The others would be cut off from export right away. But within a year, nearly everyone would starve to death. Not total extinction, according to Alan Roebuck and Brian Toon and others who've looked at this in the last few years, because a few people would live on fish and mollusks in New Zealand or Australia, mostly in the southern hemisphere. Everyone else would starve to death.
So
and that would have been the
99%,
effect, finally, that
yes.
would have been the effect as early as the Berlin crises in the early 50s, because the US had 1,000 weapons in 1952, atom bombs, but enough to cause the fires, not enough to cause fallout, to wipe everybody out. They were only atom bombs, like the cores that were made at Rocky Flats that trigger thermonuclear weapons. But the atom bombs would cause the fires. Truman had 1,000 of them, enough for nuclear winter. If Berlin crisis had arisen then, we wouldn't be here. Eisenhower comes in, the H-bomb, 1,000 times more powerful than the atom bomb, much more fire, and where there's fire, there's smoke. When Eisenhower left office, there were 23,000 nuclear weapons, mostly H-bombs. And now, at the height, that got up to about 70,000 weapons in the world. The US had about 36,000, the Russians had about 40,000 in 1986. And yes, it's gone down by 85%, 88% now, and still far more than enough to cause nuclear winter. We have 1,550 on alert, the Russians about the same. 200 or 300 wipes out nearly everyone. So there has been no effect of these reductions on the likelihood of nuclear winter, nor has there been a change in the hair triggers involved on both sides, getting the weapons off before the other side's weapons arise. Both sides are committed to launch on warning at this point, and a false alarm of the kind that has happened a number of times in the last years, a false alarm then can wipe us all out. So there are 2 doomsday machines in the world. And if I can finally quote, and maybe not for the last time, Greta Thunberg on this point, she points out that perhaps as someone with Asperger's, she is more inclined to see the world generally in black and white terms than other people. But she said correctly, some things are black and white. The question of whether some nuclear weapons can be justified as a deterrent is a difficult, problematic question. It's not easy to decide. There's controversy, reasonable controversy on it. A doomsday machine, which is what the US has had since 1950 and has today. Russia has had, for the world, actually only since the mid-60s, but ever since, been just as dangerous and reckless and irresponsible as we are, and as NATO is. That's black and white. There is no conceivable justification for that doomsday machine.
You mustn't give the whole book away, because it's a must-read for the whole of this audience, of course. But the point is that, of course, we have now 2 doomsday machines, one in the US and one in Russia, with an effect and a possibility to actually wipe out 99% of the population in today's world. And this is also what you then said about the Titanic, my reference being on Titanic on a moonless night in Ellsberg waters. So you often bring...
We're on the Titanic in Ellsberg waters, full speed ahead in a dark night.
So this denial and also deception that I think is sort of the core in your book, how can we combat it? Because it's a must for our government to act and also for our populations to also understand the gravity in this threat that is also real. And I want to turn to you now, Josephine, as you also, as a board member or steering committee member of ICANN, the Nobel Prize winner of, well, 2 years ago now, as time flies. How can we work to also increase the knowledge and, well, comprehension about this enormous threat that is facing, well, all of us?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, everyone. It's a great honor to be here today, and sorry for my cold. It's I think, one of the big issues of today to inform and educate the population, since I think since the end of Cold War, everyone thought the issue of nuclear weapons would solve itself, and it apparently didn't. But I think one of the good merits in the past decade is that we have managed to transform the debate around nuclear weapons to focus on the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons instead of being an arms control issue. And I think that's getting states to talk about and define nuclear weapons as weapons of mass destruction is one way to inform also the public and population on the horrors of nuclear war. And of course, this new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons is also a way for governments to stand up against nuclear arms and the nuclear arms race and deterrence. And I think we all in civil society has the responsibility, but also governments have the responsibility to show leadership and courage to say no to nuclear weapons and to stand up for multilateral solutions and to disarm and pressure the nuclear open states to disarm.
In his book, Mr. Ellsberg compared...
I apologize. My hearing is so bad. Can you tell me just briefly?
She talked a little bit about the important role of civil society to also push for further knowledge, but also to push the governments to be bold and courageous. In your book, Mr. Ellsberg, he also compares the nuclear weapon arsenal in a way as a terrorist threat. It's comparable to a terrorist threat in a way because it also endangers the whole of the population and civilians in a way quite similar to the actions of terrorism. Would you agree to this?
Definitely. I mean, nuclear weapons are weapons designed to slaughter civilians, and that's what they are intended to do. So definitely, and I agree with the consequences described by Mr. Ellsberg. They are horrific, and I think the only way to prevent this is to disarm and to pressure.
The Olof Palme International Center, we recently did a study we used the opinion polling institute asking the Swedish population, and 85% of the Swedes said that they wanted Sweden to join or to vote, to ratify, the UN ban on nuclear weapons. What is your reaction to this? Would you say that there is a similar kind of strong support in the country where you're from, and how otherwise to also raise support in other countries?
The poll you mentioned, which you tell me about, is just a poll. It's an opinion, tells an opinion. It could be described as a kind of hope. What will happen, right? That's what it is. And as Greta Thunberg keeps saying, hope by itself is not enough. We need action. And the question you're talking now about potential pressure, hope doesn't, and an opinion doesn't necessarily lead to pressure. It's a little bit of pressure. It's possible, it's pressure, if anyone, on your parliament. And it probably could be more effective than simply telling a pollster what you would like to happen. Actually, a number of studies have been made in my country of people's positions on different policy issues, and found almost no correlation whatever between the public attitude and the actual policy that emerges, even though these people, politicians, have to be elected. But they don't necessarily assume that an opinion on this position or that position or that position or almost any position will be reflected in voting activity. It'll be other things. So they have to be convinced, if it's true, that this is a high priority. And I don't take it for granted that it is a high priority to ratify this treaty or to sign the treaty. It might or might not be. I was very upset in 1984, 84, yes, when after 85% of the American people, just as you say in this case, voted for, had the opinion and supported even in marches and other things, a freeze on nuclear weapons, stopping the production on both sides, which, by the way, Brezhnev, of all people, had actually supported at that point. So here's the American people as a whole. You can't find 85% who can usually name the vice president entirely. So this was amazing. And yet they went ahead and gave Reagan, who was against the freeze, Palme was for it, by the way. They gave Reagan an overwhelming majority. I can say I was really depressed after that. I thought it revealed to me that although I felt the people were on my side here, but not in priority, not in action. They didn't vote on it. They didn't take action, and the politicians could afford to ignore them. So it probably is less than 85% of Swedes who care about this issue, but the one, much less, perhaps, of the 85%. But if the ones who care, I would urge them, from my own experience in America, take further measures to make their politicians aware that the politicians will be fired if they don't carry out this preference. And by the way, I don't take it, I have to admit here, I don't take it as open and shut that ratification of the UN is appropriate for any given country. There are problems on it. I can see that's something to discuss elsewhere. But I can understand reasons, but for not doing it. I don't understand any good reasons for not signing it or for not being an observer and being part of the process, as Switzerland has. But I can think of two reasons that I've read the discussion now of the Swedes. Well, we'll go into that later. Yeah. But I am saying that I think civil society, to the extent that they do want to see pressure on the US and Russia, that is what is needed. Secondly, by the way, pressure on India and Pakistan. An India-Pakistan war with just 100 atom bombs. We're talking about the bombs that are the triggers for thermonuclear weapons. That's all India and Pakistan have now, unless there's further testing. 100 atom bombs would not cause nuclear winter. Instead of blocking the sun by 80%, it would block it only by 7%. And that would have the effect of shortening harvests, lowering harvests in America, in China, soybeans and everything, to the extent that 2 billion people, between 1 and 2 billion people would starve. By India and Pakistan, does that give everyone in the world a right, but especially these poorer countries, we're on this, a right to demand of India and Pakistan that they have too many weapons already with their 100 each of atom bombs, that they have no right to be contemplating the use of those weapons under any circumstances? I would say yes. The point I think you made earlier, that this is terrorism. Everybody in the world is hostage to India and Pakistan with their 200 weapons together. How about the US and Russia with their 15,000 thermonuclear weapons together? Everyone in the world is held hostage. This Palme called conventional bombing of Hanoi torture, as my wife had, in effect. Actually, that's a metaphor. A better word is terror, for something that actually kills people in order to influence other people. But each of them takes hostages. Everyone in the world is a hostage to these policies.
Time flies.
So they have a right. They have a right to go outside channels to bring pressure on their own politicians, to in turn bring pressure to bear on, especially the first two countries, the two superpowers, India and Pakistan in particular, who dare to hold the world hostage. etc.
You've made my job completely impossible, but it's also because you have so much to tell us. And I had actually also promised a couple of people in the audience to ask questions, but we will not, unfortunately, have time to do this. But we have also a reception within short, so there will be a possibility to approach you and to ask questions just in a little bit. So, and also, of course, Josephine, you will also be here for a continued reception outside, but we have plenty of people that also want to enter this stage before wrapping up. And let me just, no, we don't have more time to discuss, unfortunately. There will be Friday, we have a seminar also on Friday and so on, so you will have plenty of more time, but not in this setting, unfortunately. So by this, I just want to thank the both of you, Josephine and of course Mr. Ellsberg, once again. Congratulations, congratulations on your book. And let me just end by a quote that you also end your book with, that I think is very memorable and that will also inspire all of us after listening to the both of you. So it's a quote by Dr. Martin Luther King, and he says, "Now let us begin, now let us rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter but beautiful struggle for a new world." So thank you all. Thank you.
And now to end, we will call back, welcome back, Richard Söderberg and my son, Darling, please.
When all the world is a hopeless jumble, and the raindrops tumble all around, heaven opens a magic gate. When all the clouds darken up the highway, there's a rainbow highway to be found, leading from your window pane. There's a place behind the sun, just a step beyond the rain. Somewhere over the rainbow, way up high, there's a land that I've heard of once in a lullaby. Somewhere over the rainbow, skies are blue, and the dreams that you dare to dream really do come true. the clouds are far behind. When rubble melts like lemon drops away above the chimney top, that's where you'll find me. Somewhere over the rainbow, skies are blue, and the dreams that you dare to dream really do come true. Where happy little bluebirds fly above the rainbow, why, oh why can't I? Min resa var mot solen, långt bortom alla slutna rum, där allting är oändligt och alla gränser har för evigt suddats ut. Jag ville se mirakel och höra ord som föder liv. Bli buren av en styrka som bara växer när vi anat vårt motiv. Ljus i ett land utan namn. Ge mig liv där allting föds på och så när allt förändras, tiden inte längre finns, då ser jag oss tillsammans, och då är resan slut och det enda som vi minns.
Rickard, stanna snäll, och Mikael, kan du också komma upp? Och Daniel, would you like to come up here? And Margot, please. And maybe Ingvar Carlsson, who was such a defender of human rights. And please, please. Yes, you have to. Yes, yes, Ingvar Carlsson, this was a coup, but I think we have had a historic evening in many ways, and I think we needed that song at the end. We needed it to continue. We had the courage, Mikael, to go onwards. And if Daniel Ellsberg can do this fight, take this fight, we can all do it if we want to. Thank you all.